Welcome once again to the Gaming News Canada show, and once again, I'm your host, Steve McAllister. When it comes to the business of sports betting and online gaming across North America, so much for the dog days of summer. So, as we leap like Simone Biles into August, we invited back to the podcast the gambling industry beat writer extraordinaire for covers, Geoff Zochodne. Hey, Geoff, let's first off, whatever happened to summer break?
It's funny, we were talking about this today. There's no slow news days really in this business. It just seems like every day there's something new popping up, and you just gotta you gotta tough it out and just get ready for it, because what's the saying, man plans and God changes or something like that. It's been pretty intense, and the cadence of news just hasn't slowed at all.
No, it's been almost like a Gatling gun effect this summer. And again, we didn't see each other at the Canadian Gaming Summit. I believe you were down in Halifax. The covers had their annual offsite, so we didn't get a chance to catch up there. But since then, it's been a runaway train for you. It's interesting. I mentioned Simone Biles in the introduction, and the one story that seems to have flown under the radar a little bit, and there might be something in the aftermath of Paris 2024, but you haven't seen a lot about the Olympics and sports betting. I mean, obviously we see that Bet Rivers is back with spending a lot of money on CBC advertising to the games, and again, the commercial with Dan O'Toole, it's a love-hate relationship between the audiences, but I'm actually a bit surprised at how quiet it has been with the Olympics.
Yeah, I guess I can understand it from that way. I think there is probably a bit of self-control on the part of the industry. You don't want to come off too gauche by pushing the betting part too hard during it's very much an event about the athletes and about the sanctity of sport in some way. And so I can see not wanting to push it too hard, to rub people the wrong way in that regard. And we have seen too in the amateur athletic community, especially, not a real love of regulated sports betting, real concerns about what it means for the athletes there. And so it does seem, while you probably do have some opportunities to bring in customers who are interested in wagering on. We just saw the Canadian basketball team lose there. There was probably some heavy interest from locals in that, but just not wanting to push it too hard and rub people the wrong way, because we've seen how the winds have blown lately when it comes to the industry and some of the trends and some of the pushback from the public. And so why take another risk, I guess.
There were a few eyebrows raised. OLG announced a sponsorship or a partnership right before the games, and that was around their lottery product, and that's with the Canadian Olympic Committee and using athletes. I think Andre DeGrasse is one of the athletes used, and again, forgive me for forgetting some of the other athletes, and again, given the advertising standards around sports betting with the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario, I think some folks were wondering if this was a bit of a runaround, but it seems to me there's nothing untoward happening here.
Yeah, and I think operators, they've figured out what can and can't really fly with regulators here. The AGCO, those changes came into effect months ago, so plenty of time to replan and to get on side with that, and also to run any advertising plans you might have for the Olympics by regulators, give them a bit of a heads up in that regard. So yeah, I can see it. Andre DeGrasse, he had an interesting partnership, I think, back when the regulated market launched with Coolbet, right? Like he was involved there, and that was Coolbet, of course, eventually exited the Ontario market, but there are opportunities for Olympic athletes in sports betting. And so, to see, or I guess in this case with OLG on the lottery side. So, yeah, I mean, it's just that time of year where people are very interested in the Olympics. And so associating yourself with Olympic athletes for, not just the gaming industry or the lottery industry, but just industries all across the board. Everyone's trying to kind of associate themselves in some way there.
Yeah, Maggie McNeil, the Canadian swimmer, is one of the other athletes featured in that campaign. And the one thing I will say is anytime Olympic athletes can make some money through endorsement deals. I'm as long as nothing illegal, I'm certainly on board with that, because as we've come to see over decades, I mean, it's tough sledding for Olympic athlete in terms of making money. So these partnership deals are extremely important to those athletes beyond the karting money that they receive from the government of Sport Canada, which isn't a lot of money. I want to talk to you about a couple of Canadian stories that you've been following quite closely. And the first one is the Ontario Court of Appeal case over the liquidity issue. We had Paul Burns and Jack Tabman on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and it was a story that you were covering the same week that we had Paul and Jack on the podcast. Anything, Geoff, that really struck you from what we've seen from the hearing so far, and the testimony and actually the organizations that are involved in this case?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ground to cover in these records that were filed now with the court, and that was part of sort of what was this early conflict we saw in the early going of it. And I think, your pod touching on this really covered a lot of ground and got a lot of meat off the bone there, because I kind of had to laugh, and I think I mentioned this to you when I heard Jack say it was kind of like Festivus, where there was like an airing of grievances there. I think I had actually taken a day or two and tried to go through all the documents first before I wrote anything. And I think the lead I had penned initially was something along the lines of like an airing of grievances. And after I listened to the pod that night, I'm like, I think I'm going to have to rejig this somewhat. Because, there was a lot of concerns raised by the members of the Canadian Lottery Coalition. They wanted to file a pretty hefty record with the court, and there was pushback on some of the details in there. And so that was what we saw on July 16th, an endorsement from the judge who is overseeing the reference at this point, saying that, the CLC members, as well as British Columbia, could file their proposed evidence in its entirety, including some bits that were disputed by the Canadian Gaming Association. And the disputed parts, they really had to do with allegations of Ontario regulated operators conducting themselves allegedly in other parts of Canada. And that's really where you saw the pushback. And the pushback had to do a lot with, is this relevant to the question of whether or not we can have people playing, DraftKings DFS in Ontario against somebody from outside of Canada. And ultimately the judge said, I'm not going to really say that the ruling was that it may be relevant to the question before the court, so it was kept in. It could be disputed again in November when the actual hearing of the reference is supposed to happen. It's like a 3-day hearing. But yeah, like that was really the newsiest part, because you had to have this decision by the judge whether or not to allow this stuff to be entered into the record for the reference. And so that was really, it's obviously the bit that stood out the most, but also there was just a ton of stuff that was submitted overall, right? Where you had, affidavits from Ontario on this, including, in addition to the affidavits, just a ton of old parliamentary debates about how gaming law has sort of evolved throughout the decades in Canada. So all of this is now going to be before the judges, and they can kind of sort through it. And really, it's all going to boil down to, the question is funny, because not only does it say, is it legal if you can have people from Ontario play, having legal sports betting, engaging in legal sports betting, legal online gaming? Is it still legal if we include people from outside of Canada in those games? And there's also that one little bit at the end that says, and if so or if not, like, to what extent is this legal? So there could be a yes or a no, or a yes and maybe, and some sort of in between. But yeah, the stuff that really stood out to me is that you have that concern from parties who have had issues with what they say is unregulated gaming within their jurisdictions. And so that's really been the sticking point so far. But the fact that there's so much stuff filed into the record means that we could have a lot of argument and debate about some really interesting things. And in some ways, what Ontario has done is really prompted some interesting legal discussion and ultimately legal, I guess you could say, precedent, like we saw with the iGaming Ontario case with the Mohawk Council of Ganawage. That court issue. That was very interesting in that you saw a judge give what is probably one of the most, if not the most, concrete definition of what conduct and manage gaming means in Canada, which of course is a crucial term because that is the language in the criminal code talking about, what is permitted in terms of gambling throughout Canada. So this might be another instance where we see some very interesting decisions come out of and arguments given and ultimately decisions rendered that, could guide the future of gaming law in Canada for some time.
And again, we see the Mohawk Council Kanawagi. They're a participant in this hearing as well. I guess we shouldn't be surprised by that, given some of the other players that we've been seeing. I guess the one party that's not represented, Geoff, are the players. And we talked to Paul a little bit about this and Jack 2 weeks ago on just the fact, again, I think it's accepted practice if you're an online poker player or you're a daily fantasy player. You really don't care where your competition comes from. That's part of the fun, is that you're playing people from across the board. Obviously, that's not something that the court really has an interest in, but it is an interesting or a question, I guess, that should be raised from a customer's perspective.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that you mentioned that, because we've seen recently in the U.S. the formation of a new kind of bettors advocacy group called American Bettors Voice, which is backed by Billy Walters, of course, a famous sports bettor, as well as some other prominent people in the kind of gambling Twitter social sphere, as well as a longtime casino gaming executive too, who's involved with that. And what they're doing is they're going before regulators, whether it's the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, that one in particular, but also too some like get-togethers of whether it's the National Council of Gaming Legislator or legislators from gaming states, NCLGs. They also spoke before the Sports Betting Regulators Association. And so there is that kind of movement towards creating some kind of an advocacy group for the player, right? Which, as you point out, that sort of institution does not, is not part of this reference at this point. But I think if you had to ask the people who are most interested in seeing what happens here from a player's perspective, the people that used to play a lot of DFS or poker in Ontario, the main concern is, and the one that I've heard from people, is that they just kind of want it back the way it used to be, because it's, poker's been very hollowed out by the change in regulation in Ontario, and DFS is essentially, the biggest names are non-existent in the province, from that business perspective. So I think if you polled the players on this, they would say, just give us back what we used to have, because we really like that. And also too, you might, depending on how the court rules on this, you could see the door open to some perhaps new faces in the industry coming into Ontario who aren't there right now. And I'm thinking along the lines of like Prize Picks or Underdog, fantasy companies that have pushed those traditional DFS operators in the U.S. a bit, including in some ways that some regulators in the U.S. feels a little too close to actual sport betting, but nonetheless have really started to encroach on that duopoly that kind of sprung up around DFS, and have really started making names for themselves. Perhaps if the Court of Appeal opens a door to return to kind of the way things were, maybe we start to see some of those names take an interest in Ontario just from a purely fantasy perspective.
Yeah, and we do know there were some small daily fantasy players who were even leery about coming in the Ontario market 2 years ago, just because of the cost of doing business here. And again, you wonder if that court decision does change the landscape, if those smaller players will want to come in. And again, I'm not an expert on DFS, but even for those players, is it attractive enough to come in when you probably are going to have to compete against the DraftKings and FanDuels and Underdogs and Prize Picks, that it may just not make business sense.
That's true. And, the cost is what the cost is, right? It's, you have to pay $100,000 per year per site in Ontario, because you have a definition, paid fantasy contests are considered by the AGCO to be gambling. And so you would fall within that online gambling bucket of regulation. So you'd have to pay the registration fee. And also you'd have to be subject to that, to the revenue share with iGaming Ontario, which is in the neighborhood of around 20%. And that might be too cost prohibitive for some people, especially too in daily fantasy or poker, where the money isn't, it's a rake, right? Like you're taking a percentage of the game, or a small percentage from the players in the game that goes to you. And so when you have entities like DraftKings and FanDuel, and they said it didn't make economical sense for them to do it just in Ontario because the game would just be so much smaller that the cost of putting them on was just not the return wasn't there for them. So yeah, that perhaps would still weigh on some of the smaller operators, but we would have to see it again. And we're kind of like looking all the way around the corner here because we still have yet to hear what the Court of Appeal is going to say with regard to the question that's before them, which is can we do this at all?
Hey, Geoff, it's been about 6-7 weeks now since Dale Nally, the Minister of Service, Alberta, and Red Tape Reduction, appeared at the Canadian Gaming Summit. I think probably the most talked about speech of the week, and the news that it's not a matter of if, but when legal gaming or regulated gaming comes to Alberta, that there doesn't seem to have been a lot of movement this summer. Mark Keys from CDC Game Reports had a story last week about responsible gambling being part of the conversation. There have been the point's been raised. Amanda Brewer was on the podcast a few weeks ago and talked about the inability of sports books to come into land-based casinos in Ontario and have branded sports books, and she wondered if Alberta might be a different story. And again, that there's a real interesting dynamic in Alberta where there are so many casinos and just the relationships there. Any insight you can provide on that?
No, not a ton, unfortunately. It does seem like we settled into a bit of a lull, but I think that's more of a public lull, right? I'm sure there are some public servants in Alberta that are working very hard on this and are trying to work through all the various concerns of the various stakeholders in the province, and try to, and also too, there are consultations that are being had with First Nations, Indigenous communities there that they're trying to ensure that they're not left out of this conversation. And as you point out too, Alberta has a bit of a unique model when it comes to land-based gaming that's different from what Ontario had. And we saw the issues with Ontario and just getting, a retail setup going. In that, in Alberta especially, they have this sort of charitable gaming model that incorporates a lot more people, you could say, that are interested in what happens with land-based gaming, because you have charities that are, this is a big source of revenue for them. And so if there are any concerns there, they would have to kind of be addressed up front. And I'm sure the government wants to hear what's going on. But I think what we are kind of entering into is we saw legislation passed earlier this year in the Alberta legislature that kind of set the table for an iGaming framework, perhaps similar to what we've seen in Ontario. It clarified that the government could conduct and manage gaming on its own. And so my expectation is that we're really kind of looking for some sort of proposed regulation or order in council or something on that line, talking about perhaps an entity similar to iGaming Ontario, because that is sort of the crux of Ontario's system, where they had this agency created through which you can conduct and manage the gaming of private entities, and I'm phrasing that pretty clumsily, but really, it's the sort of next step. If there's going to be an Ontario-like system, you would think there has to be an Ontario-like system of regulation. And looking at how Ontario did it, they created this new agency. This agency contracts with the operators, and that contract clarifies exactly how much control that agency has over the operations of those businesses. And that was really a key thing we saw during the MCK legal drama that played out, and that it really boiled down to, how much control does the province have here, and does that constitute conduct and manage? And so now that we kind of have that decision set out, Alberta can fashion a system that matches up with that legal decision too. And so I'm kind of keeping my eyes peeled for any kind of proposed regulation, anything along those lines, and we'll see what happens. I reached out to the province today and just said, what's going on here? It's the summer too. I'm sure people are trying to get a bit of a break. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. And also too, the timeline is one that's been kind of mulled around, been mulled over a bit. There's been some interest voiced about key dates on the sporting calendar, right? Whether that's the Grey Cup,
Right.
the Super Bowl, March Madness. So we'll see. I mean, those are sort of the traditional launch points. Even though we saw in Ontario, launching April 4th, 2022, there was not a Super Bowl or anything around the corner there. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be, we kind of have heard enough that we have an expectation of what things are generally going to look like, but also too, it's not exactly apples to apples with Ontario. So you have to manage expectations and consult with everyone and make sure that everyone sort of knows what's coming. So you can kind of address all these things up front and you're not having to worry about it on the back end.
Yeah, we found out this week that Ballybet is going to open a sports online sports book on Ontario, and I think that brings us, if it's not 51 now, it must be around 50, the number of legal operators on Ontario. I think, Geoff, something that has been talked about a lot is just what that market will look like out there, and again, not going to hold you to a number, but when you talk to people about Alberta, are they looking at an equal number of operators, half the operators, a third of the operators? Like what would be an educated guess?
If I had to make a guess, I'd probably say, maybe 75% of what you see in Ontario, at least. It could very well just be 100% too, if what we're hearing in some ways, and that, how close it matches up with the Ontario model, that you can kind of just, if you're Ontario regulated, you have a very easy road to get into Alberta. But that's what I would kind of put it at, just kind of doing, thinking about it in my head, who would be interested there. And then, there's a few different reasons for that, just because obviously the population of Alberta is a bit smaller. So the market potential is a bit smaller there. But on the other hand, you have all of these operators who they want, they've said, if there's an opportunity for us to be regulated, we'll take that opportunity and we'll come in and abide by those rules. So that's part of, the whole decision of deciding to have one of these regulated markets and competitive markets, is that you're kind of calling the bluff a bit on some of the operators who perhaps aren't regulated in your jurisdiction yet, and saying, here's now our system, and feel free to come in and file your application and subject yourself to our local rules and all that. And so now that that's out there, you have to be true to your word and you have to follow through on it. And so just because of that, I think it would be a pretty high percentage, and maybe just a bit, if there is some, if it is a bit less than Ontario, I think you'd have to chalk that up more to just the market opportunity, because it does sound like the tax rate is going to be in line with what we've seen in Ontario. I guess it would be a revenue share rate technically. You're also going to have the opportunity to do both sports betting and online casino games, which is huge for the operators. iGaming is something, of course, for them that they've pushed for in the U.S. So a lot of those entities down there, and it can help to overcome some of the other concerns you might have about the market, especially one that it is the province itself. The population, while it's not as big as Ontario's, it's still sizable in that it's somewhere in the realm of like a Kentucky or Louisiana, where we saw the biggest names jump in there when they were offered the opportunity. So I would expect at the very least you would see a lot of familiar faces in Alberta.
Hey, you talk about the timing of the sports calendar too, and this is something we've talked about here so often. And when you look at Ontario, given I think it's like an 85 or 86, 14% split now in terms of how much money is being spent on iGaming and how much is sports betting. I guess on one hand, you can make the case that maybe the sports calendar, that when you launch it isn't all that important. But I'm thinking also from a marketing and advertising standpoint, if you launch something around a Grey Cup or Super Bowl or a major sporting event, that's certainly something that the folks who operate the marketing and advertising budgets with those operators, that's going to be attractive to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, having a tent pole event that you can launch around, of course, is helpful. Um, it also is helpful too for regulators and lawmakers to give themselves a target to sort of aim for. But I think too that this is something that while maybe you'd love to have it synced up with like the Grey Cup or anything like that, it's going to take however long it takes, right? Like we've kind of seen in the US especially, where you've had states really pushed to get regulated markets up and running on the sports betting side, only for lawmakers and regulators perhaps like 6 months, a year later, have a bit of remorse over how it was laid out and want to re-legislate, re-regulate, change things, which is that's also part of regulating online gambling, is that once you regulate it, you can keep tinkering with it. It's not once you legalize it and launch the market, that's not the end of it. It's an evergreen sort of thing. So it's both it's a bit of a double-edged sword in that you have to keep regulating it, but also you can keep regulating it, and so you can keep making changes. So yeah, I mean, it's a very the timing, of course, is something that'll be really interesting and perhaps could be helpful to them, but it's going to take however long it takes to do all the consultations, get all the regulation, and also to get everyone just, I guess, comfortable in a spot to launch. And so it I feel like this is a very unhelpful comment on my part, but it takes however long it takes.
Yeah, and it feels like, to your point earlier, Geoff, that this story is probably going to gather a lot of steam post Labor Day when people come back to work from summer vacation. Obviously, the Alberta government's got some serious issues to deal with the forest fires and what's happened in Jasper and other parts of Alberta. So again, I certainly don't want to trivialize what's happening out there, and that the provincial government's dealing with some serious stuff right now. One of the reasons why I wanted to get you on the podcast this week was, a story that resonates beyond the sports betting and gaming industry is Geoff Marek's departure from Sportsnet, which was confirmed about 2 weeks ago now. And I want to, the best reporting I think both of us have seen so far on this story was a piece done by Katie Strang and Dan Robson in The Athletic that came out last week. And I just want to quickly read for people that haven't been following the story. Geoff Marek suddenly left. Was in Las Vegas for the NHL draft at the end of June. My understanding is that Geoff flew home on a red eye the night of the first round, back to Toronto. Wasn't heard from on social media for 3 or 4 weeks, and then it was Sportsnet announced, I think 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago now, that Geoff was no longer with Sportsnet. Obviously, an outpouring of support for Geoff, who's I've known Geoff myself for about 10 or 15 years now, and was involved when I was at Yahoo in the Marek versus Wyshynski podcast with Geoff and Greg Wyshynski, who's now at ESPN. Quality guy, obviously passionate hockey guy, has a lot of fans across the country. But I just want to read quickly from Katie and Dan's story to put context, if you haven't been following it, that a quote, "In July, Sportsnet quietly parted ways with Marek. It was the kind of move that normally would have warranted a public statement, but the reason behind it led both parties to choose silence. Marek had come under scrutiny from the NHL during the first round of the draft for allegedly revealing to a friend which players' teams were drafting moments before those picks were publicly announced, according to league and media industry sources. The NHL shared concerns about the situation with the Nevada Gaming Control Board, which probed further, according to multiple sources on that investigation." The Nevada Gaming Control Board didn't give much of a statement to The Athletic, basically saying they don't comment on investigations. The NHL and Sportsnet also declined to comment, as did Marek. But Geoff, we've seen something similar to this before, where as you mentioned before we hit the record button today, broadcasters, journalists, quote insiders, that there's kind of a fine line there in terms of how information is released and its potential impact on the betting world, and that this story appears to fall within those parameters.
Yeah, that's my sort of read on it. And again, we're going off of someone else's work here.
Yes.
And, I've not spoken to Jeff Marek. I've not really poked around in this a lot myself. So it's a lot of reading between the lines and into what perhaps has gone on. But just speaking more broadly about journalists and insiders and broadcasters and betting, we've seen a real sensitivity around that. For some very good reasons. Sports bettors naturally are a bit of how do I politely put this, a conspiratorial bunch, tending to see things that a penalty flag thrown in a certain direction they don't like, kind of seeing some motives behind it, that sort of thing. So there is always that question when you have people who work for media entities that are associated with sports books and the information that comes out from them. So trying to read between the lines on this one, it feels like, you're the NHL, you're having your draft in Las Vegas in the Sphere. It looks like there was concern about some of the sanctity of information that is kind of being, I guess, if you're working behind the scenes or you're involved with that, you're sort of privy to and how it gets used and how it's supposed to be safeguarded. And so the involvement here of the Nevada gaming regulators strikes me a bit more as, especially reading some of the other reporting where it seemed very clear that there was no financial incentive or benefit to really anyone involved. It seems more like that was just done out of like due diligence and to ensure to kind of clear the air that way, just because you're already in a very sensitive spot. Again, being in Vegas, and then the embrace of sports betting by leagues in general, they want to ensure that they're showing to fans, bettors, that everything is above board and sound. And so I guess we'll see what, if anything, comes out of that process. But we've seen too, you have reporters who are involved with FanDuel. You have ESPN, of course, lending its name to an entire online sports book. And interestingly, when it came to ESPN Bet, before its launch, you saw ESPN introduce, a kind of betting related code of conduct for its talent, laying out what you can and can't do, including a prohibition on insiders dabbling in wagering on sports that they very closely covered to prevent someone like, say, Adam Schefter making a big bet on a guy being traded or moving to another team while he's sitting on the information because the sources are giving it to him. So trying to avoid anything that way. But, to the more recent situation, it just seems like everything here is more everyone just being very cautious about what's going on. And yeah, it seems like took a very unfortunate turn, and it's just, the media environment has changed with the introduction of, so much more legal sports betting and legal sports betting partnerships that, I'm sure this probably won't be the last type of situation we see like this.
The other thing too that strikes me is this is the second time now that the NHL's had a story like this. I mean, the Shane Pinto suspension a year ago, and strangely, Pinto came out, and we talked to Paul Burns about this. Pinto came out a couple of weeks ago and told a podcast what the reason he was suspended, and that was supposed to be secret. And I believe the Marek story, there's obviously a whole bunch of levels of gray here, but again, the reluctance or the inability or whatever you want to call it, that the fact that there's not a lot of transparency on a story like this, you wonder, again, couldn't there be lessons learned if there was transparency? But again, I realize it's not that black and white.
Yeah, it's a tough thing where I'm sure there are, some employment related factors too, with someone, on privacy related factors, and also too, I'm sure there is some trying to ascertain what exactly has happened, and then trying to get all the facts in before there is any release of, a public statement, if there is ever going to be one. The Pinto situation, as you pointed out, was very curious in that the press release announcing suspension was very thrifty on the information about what had actually taken place to prompt that kind of discipline. And then we get it firsthand eventually. But this was not like an official release in that way. And so I look too, though, at, the NBA with the Jonte Porter controversy. That ended up being more transparent than perhaps what we're used to, but it was for a few different reasons, including that you had the engagement of federal law enforcement, right, who then were putting out criminal complaints that containing a bushel of allegations. And so, the NBA really, they put out a lot of information on their own account, just trying to tell people what happened. And so, I'm a reporter. Obviously, I'm going to favor transparency and giving us everything you can. And I think, too, that's really just a smart way to go about it, because, like I said earlier, you already have people that are involved in betting on sports that think everything's rigged. And so you don't want, if people, and this is something that's come up when just in the broader conversation about ensuring the integrity of games, is that if people think that there's something off, sure, yes, maybe they won't bet on it, maybe they won't play fantasy, but it can ultimately too turn off the fans who think that, if there's something weird going on, they just don't want to be interested in it. They just won't be as interested in it as they used to be. So yeah, it's the whole like I said earlier, just the nature of things have really changed when it comes to sports media in that way. And that you not only have to do the right thing, but you have to show to people that you're trying to do the right thing at the very least as well, and try to give them as much information as they can to, stop imaginations from running wild.
Hey, Geoff, a couple more stories before we let you go. I wanted to point out you had a really interesting piece a week or so ago about consolidation in the sports betting industry in the U.S. And we've seen a number of operators pull out of the U.S. I guess in the last 12 to 18 months. I'm just curious, like what motivated you to write that story, and what takeaways are there from what you've seen with consolidation? And it's interesting, when we started Gaming News Canada, or maybe when the market opened back in April 2022, one of the things that you and I think, and Robin McNeil and Dave Briggs and others would talk about when we saw each other at these gaming conferences was consolidation, and how long would it be before the small fish got swallowed by the bigger fish and on the Ontario market. And we really haven't seen that. I guess maybe a little bit of a different story south of the border.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Ontario angle, because if you said to someone in Ontario, check out all this consolidation going on and people dropping out of the market, they'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, they probably feel like they're still kind of like swimming in sports betting and online casino options. And they're not wrong in thinking that, because you do have just a wide selection here. But that really comes back to, I think, the ability of operators to offer both sports betting and online casino gaming. It's really having that, having the iGaming definition in Ontario mean both online sports betting and online casino play is really beneficial for the operators. And for proof, you only really need to look at a company like PointsBet, which divested its U.S. assets, but remains operational in Ontario and is eyeing opportunities in Alberta right now. And that has to do with the fact that, they can add that online casino to their operations, which they couldn't do in a lot of U.S. states. And so as a result, you don't see the same kind of exits we've seen from the Ontario market as we have in the U.S. And so what I was kind of getting into with the piece that you pointed out was that we're seeing a lot of the smaller players calling quits on the market, and some of them, it's because they weren't competitive for. Sometimes it's their own fault. Sometimes the product's just not up to snuff with some of the bigger players, and you could argue that they don't have the resources to keep up with some of the technology that's out there, and that's fair. But some of them, you kind of feel like they just thought, we throw out this online sports book and people will just show up no matter what. And it just hasn't proven to be the case for everybody. And we've really seen in the US a duopoly form of DraftKings and FanDuel. And the third place BetMGM, they've fallen back enough to the point where, their owners and the company itself have declared that this year has to be an investment year where they need to spend some money to try to regain ground that they've lost. And so for me, I feel like I've written this column a few different times, and I might have, because I feel like there are thoughts I kind of keep having. But for me, it was thinking about, who really loses when you see consolidation like this. And part of what got me thinking about that is the conversation we've seen spring up in the US around the limiting of sports bettors. And while the population of people who may not be able to wager as much as they want could be as low as 1% of all bettors, which is what DraftKings has put out there in some conversations. Who we don't have official data on this. We're kind of taking the word. So, but for me, it's if there are fewer places to play, and those places aren't letting you play, then you're not a participant in a regulated market. And that, to me, I feel like I'm trying to see where the puck's going on this a little bit, and I can see that being a bit problematic. And I see too, when you have states that have imposed, say, like a higher tax burden or regulatory burden that is preventing certain operators from getting involved in a market, say some operators that could cater to a sharper clientele, perhaps, people who want to bet more, who might know more, that some of these more recreational operators don't want to handle. They're not coming into the markets because they just can't afford to make a go of it, because that's just not their model. And so it's kind of then looking at some of the unintended consequences where maybe these jurisdictions are sort of harming themselves by not facilitating an environment that you can get, the max, you're maximizing your potential there. And so it was kind of looking at perhaps some of the unintended consequences of how things have been structured and how that sort of has now trickled down into the consolidation we're seeing. And in some ways too, it's a shame that you're seeing some, a name like Superbook, which has a very long history in Vegas. It's they're actually remaining in business in Vegas on the online side too. It's just everywhere else that they're pulling back on. But just not seeing that translate over into some of these other states. And so, yeah, it's a shame for people who put their lives and time and money and energy into getting these things off the ground, and it just didn't work out. And sometimes it didn't work out for reasons that weren't entirely their fault too. And so that was kind of what I was kind of poking at there. And then also too, looking at, how bettors, part of the promise of regulation was that you'd have better consumer protection, more choice. And if those goals aren't being met, then I think you kind of have to look at how things have been structured, and perhaps there's more to do on regulation than just some of the avenues that people involved there have gone down already.
Last topic, and that's the story that's kind of top of mind the last 5 or 6 days, and that's DraftKings and the CEO Jason Robins coming out publicly and saying that DraftKings is looking at placing a surcharge on winning wagers in the states with the highest tax rates, and that right now would be my understanding is Illinois, New York, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. Geoff, Bet Rivers came out, I think, yesterday on Monday and announced that they would not consider a surcharge. I think I saw a story today from sportshandle.com that they expect the FanDuel will follow DraftKings lead. What's the rationale here, Geoff? And do what's the bigger story here?
Well, the rationale in the eyes of DraftKings was that they're trying to make their business work in some of these higher tax jurisdictions. And, a state like New York, where the tax rate's 51%, they can't do it. And so they're going to pass some of the burden of those higher tax rates on to the bettor. That's their proposal right now. Anyways, they had some interesting renderings of how it might look, to offset that cost. And I mean, I wrote about this too last week, and to me, I thought it was more like the bigger story is more a message of DraftKings trying to send a message about the current regulatory legislative landscape and the tax burdens they face, especially when that changes sort of after the fact, as we saw in Illinois most recently, where they went from a flat, I think it was 15% rate, to now one that can go as high as 40%, after you already had operators kind of sink in a considerable amount of money into the state, which they also did in Ohio. But that was, and we saw the tax rate there double to 20%, which operators didn't like, but they're still, apparently willing to tolerate for the time being. Some of them, anyways. We did see some exits, of course. So I think the bigger story was about the sending of a message to, you could argue it's a variety of different parties, but I think the biggest one is probably to the lawmakers and regulators overseeing these states, saying, we're having, they think that they're having a pretty tough time making things make financial sense for them there. And so we're going to put this charge on to our bettors, and we're going to tell the bettors that we're doing it, which suggests to me like you want to provoke perhaps a reaction from these bettors in some way, because we've heard from operators that higher tax rates could mean that they're going to have to make their odds worse. Essentially, we're going to have to charge more vig on that, where you might have seen, minus 110, maybe we're going up to minus 113, maybe we're going up to minus 115. And you could do that on the front end, and perhaps people, less educated bettors, more recreational bettors, wouldn't care that much. They would just pay, they'd pay the toll, they'd still bet the side or bet the total money line, and there wouldn't be a whole lot of notice paid to it. But the illustration that DraftKings gave was that you would place a bet, say in Illinois, and the example they gave was like, $10 bet at odds of even money. So you would win, the total payout would be $20. But then you would see after, and this is after the bet would be placed, so you haven't technically won it yet, you would then see a Illinois gaming tax surcharge removed from the total possible payout, informing the bettor that even if you win, we're going to take this,
Right.
it was like 68 cents or something out of your total payout. So that to me seems geared toward trying to get people aware of the tax burden and perhaps to voice their frustrations, maybe to DraftKings, which DraftKings can then turn around and point to regulators. Maybe they're hoping that there's some concerns brought directly to lawmakers and regulators by those people to try to create a bit of a groundswell of opinion against how things are structured. But yeah, so that to me is the bigger story, is, why do this? And then, of course, the question, as you point out, who's coming with me? Who else is going to do this? Because if DraftKings stands alone on it, it puts them in an awkward spot. People could come in and say, we're not going to charge you that, so come bet with us. And maybe that works, or maybe people do follow. But it is, to me, a very bold step by DraftKings here to do this, because you're potentially going to bring down the wrath of regulators, legislators, your own customers. And for them, though, they just feel like this was a step that had to be taken. And so we'll see how it pans out. It's not supposed to be imposed until the start of next year. So there's some time between then and now to perhaps recast or rethink the idea altogether. But it is a very interesting step to take in the face of what seems like a growing appetite by some states and certain lawmakers to increase tax rates on the industry.
Yeah, and it's funny, here in Ontario, I think it's a 20% tax rate, and when you talk to operators, they they talk about it's not cheap to do business in Ontario, even with that tax rate, because of all the other costs and the applications and compliance and everything. But to your earlier point, Geoff, the fact that it is not just sportsbook, but online casino, that they're able to accept the fact that they maybe pay a little bit more on those, the ancillary charges, I guess we'll call it.
Which is interesting too, because one of the states that they're planning to impose this surcharge on the bettors there is Pennsylvania, which is an iGaming state. But they're saying the tax rate is onerous enough that we have to impose it there, and that it can't work even with iGaming, I guess, which is a curious thing to see. And of course, 15 more percentage points over what Ontario charges in terms of tax. But again, that just to me seems like a company set on sending a message, and it was a message that was heard very widely by the denizens of gambling Twitter, and there were a lot of takes being thrown around, and I'm sure that at least has to be part of the thinking there, is like, let's get people talking about what's going on here, and people are definitely talking.
We're going to leave it there. You can find Geoff Zochodne on X at Geoff Zochodne, GeoffZochodne. I guess C for our American listeners. And Geoff is all over. I think between him and Jessica Wellman, I think all they do all day is listen to regulators' hearings on Zoom and Google Meet, MS Teams, whatever other virtual software. Hey, Geoff, listen, really appreciate you taking the time today. I know you're busy, not only on the work front, but on the family front with a newborn. So thanks so much for taking time out and sharing your insights and perspectives on the podcast.
No problem. As your audience probably has realized by now, I do enjoy talking about this kind of stuff, because I think I went on about 20 minutes longer than we initially intended when we set out to do this.
Yeah, no, these conversations are great. Enjoy the rest of your summer. Look forward to our paths crossing again in the fall. That's it for this episode of the Gaming News Canada show. As always, you can find the podcast at gamingnewscanada.ca, also on Substack, on our YouTube channel, and on the various podcast platforms. Once again, we thank Geoff Zochodne for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody again very soon.
Thank you for listening to the Gaming News Canada show. Sign up for our newsletter at gamingnewscanada.ca. Follow Steve McAllister on LinkedIn. Message Steve if you're interested in being a sponsor or featured guest.